law itself can be provided by voluntary cooperation in the private economy. While Friedman holds a PhD in physics from the University of Chicago, he is chiefly known for his scholarly contributions to economics and law. He is the author of 5 books of nonfiction, as well as the novels Harold and Salamander. In Machinery of Freedom, Guide to Radical Capitalism, Friedman argued that an economic analysis of impact of state action points to an anarchist conclusion. In Law's Order, What Economics Has to Do with Law and Why It Matters, he shows how directing the law to seek economic efficiency can lead to the achievement of justice. Friedman stands in contrast to many other anarchists because of his consequentialist approach. Rather than arguing that humans have inviolable natural rights which are always wrong to violate, he uses cost-benefit analysis to assert that a world without government is better than one ruled by states. So without further ado, David Friedman.
Most libertarians and many conservatives have a problem. And the problem is that they believe that government is very bad at doing things. That if the government is in charge of producing food, you will have famines. And if the government is in charge of building cars, you're likely to have badly built and very expensive cars. And yet, almost all of them believe that there are certain very important things that should be done by government. The traditional list being police, courts, and national defense for the sort of classical liberal position. And obviously the response is, well, if government is bad at doing things, why do you want to have it doing these very important things? And the answer is that they believe, not unreasonably, that these are things where all other ways of doing them are even worse, where there is no practical way of doing them through the private market, and they are very important things. That having a badly run legal system is better than having no legal system. Having a badly run national defense is better than having somebody else conquer you. And that's the guts of the argument. And I spent some time this morning explaining how I thought police and courts could be replaced by private institutions. For any of you who missed that, this is my web page. That is my web page, and you will note that The Machinery of Freedom, which is a book I wrote quite a long time ago, is now webbed, and you can read it for free. And furthermore, the drafts of the new chapters that will be in the 3rd edition of that book are also now webbed. If any of you want to leave now, one of those chapters covers roughly what I'm going to speak about today. And you can read them too. Lots of other stuff is also on my webpage. I will switch back now so that anybody who wants to copy it can read it more easily. So, what I want to talk about today is what I have long regarded as the hard problem for the anarchists. Namely, how without a government would you successfully defend against other governments that wanted to conquer you? Saying you don't need national defense because you're not a nation doesn't really answer it as long as there are other nations you have to defend against. So let me start out by sketching why, from an economist standpoint, it's a problem. A problem in a sense in which law enforcement isn't, incidentally. That's why I think it's a more serious problem. Economists use the term public good not to mean a good government produces. Government produces many private goods, and many public goods are privately produced. A public good is a good such that the producer cannot control who gets it. So the public good is a good such that if it is produced at all, it will be available to all the members of some pre-existing group of people. So that a radio broadcast is a public good, even though they're actually produced privately. Mail delivery is not a public good, because if you don't pay for the stamp, they don't deliver your mail. National defense is a public good. If we have some way of keeping the Russians or the Mexicans or the Canadians or whoever the potential enemy is from invading us, the people who don't pay for it will get protected just like people who do pay for it. And that raises in general a problem of how you pay the cost of providing this good. Because each individual, in a very small group, you can do it by essentially unanimous contract. You can say, if you don't pay, I won't pay. There are only 6 of us. We'll all agree to chip in. That gets real hard with 300 million people. So then the question is, how might you plausibly solve the problem? There are, I should say, a bunch of known ways of privately producing public goods, some of which are relevant to national defense, some of which aren't. But I want to talk about my current views Machinery has a chapter called The Hard Problem, in which I sketch some ideas, but I've been thinking about it since, and I have more ideas, which is what this talk is really about. And the ideas I want to talk about come from a rather weird mixture of different sources. They include my understanding of the theory of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. They include a very strange short story by Rudyard Kipling. They include the institutions of paintball and the SCA, the Society for Creative Anachronism. And they include open source software. Those are a bunch of different sources, all of which feed into my ideas about how a society without a government might defend itself. And let me start with the Second Amendment, because all of you have associated enough with conservatives so that you're used to being talked to about the Second Amendment. As I interpret it, the Second Amendment was intended as a solution to a problem that people in the 18th century were very much aware of. It shows up in Adam Smith, it shows up elsewhere. And the problem was that, as Oliver Cromwell had demonstrated in the previous century, professional armies beat amateur armies. The New Model Army was what eventually won the first Civil War for Parliament in the 17th century. As Oliver Cromwell had also demonstrated, once you have a professional army, it's very hard to keep it from taking over the government. And Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army won the Second Civil War, in which they fought everybody else and won. There's a wonderful passage, which I won't quote, but it's in the chapter from Winston Churchill's History of the English-Speaking People, where he's describing the sort of the balance of forces in the First Civil War, and in the Second Civil War, on one side was Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army, against him, and he lists everybody else from the First War. Oliver Cromwell beat the lot. So that was a problem. You want a professional army so you can defend yourself because they win. You don't want one because it's a threat to your liberty. And I think the founders of the U.S. came up with a pretty good kludge for dealing with the problem. And the kludge was to have a small professional army and an enormous militia. And so the idea was that if you have to fight somebody else, the professional army provides sort of the expertise. The professional army has been providing the coordination to make sure that the different state militias can work together. And the militia makes up for its size when it lacks in ability. And if the professional army ever tries to take over, they're outnumbered 100 to 1, roughly. It may have been more than that, but it was at least 100 to 1 in the original system. That, I think, was their solution. And I thought it was a pretty good solution. It seems to have worked fairly well so far. It's not clear that it's relevant to the modern world, because hunting rifles are a lot less effective against military weapons than they were in the 18th century. And we want to discuss it at some point. I think there are other arguments for the Second Amendment now. But I was interested in how this same way of thinking about it might work in a stateless society. My second source is The Army of a Dream by Rudyard Kipling. And it's a rather weird story in which the narrator, who is presumably Kipling, is returning to England after a long visit. And he encounters a friend who is a military officer, who explains to him how things have changed. And the change is that the main sport in England nowadays is neither football nor cricket, it's war games. The kind of war games you play at 1 inch to an inch. That is full-scale war games, so that you've got a bunch of kids from a school who are having a mock battle with a bunch of kids from another school with professional officers as referees, who end up saying, yes, the way you've maneuvered, you would have won. All right? And Kipling, with his usual talent, gives you quite a believable picture of that world. And what he's describing is not an anarchist society. It's clear that the government and the professional military are sort of interwoven with the system. But it's a system in which most of the trained manpower is volunteers. And they're volunteering for reasons of sort of social pressure and custom, rather than because, as in Switzerland today, they are legally required to do it. And the result in the system he describes is that England can raise an enormous army at a very low cost on short notice, and therefore everybody else leaves them alone, basically. It's a neat story. At the end of the story, he notices that the friend of his who has been keeping who's been telling him this has been keeping only one side of his face towards him. And Kipling begins to remember that the person they've just talked to died of disease in the course of a war a while ago, and that the guy he's talking to, yes, he remembers his dying too. And then the person turns and you see the wound that he died from. And Kipling wakes up and you realize it was all a dream. But it's sort of his idea of how you could imagine having an effective military on basically social rather than political and economic. Now this appealed to me partly because every summer I spend a week or two with a bunch of other medieval history lunatics. And they have battles with about 1,000 men aside. All right? None of them were paid for by the US military or by taxes. They provide their own equipment, they provide their own training. Now it's true that shields and rattan swords would not be very effective in modern warfare. But the fact that you can get a whole lot of people, in effect for the fun of it, to spend a lot of their own resources, because armor costs money, and a lot of their own time and effort on a form of military training is suggestive for the possibilities of doing something similar with other technologies. And SCA, I suppose, I don't know, there are maybe 5,000 or 10,000 trained fighters in the SCA. Paintball is a much bigger hobby. And I've got some figures in the chapter, which I won't tell you because I don't remember them, but the number of people who in 1 year participate in paintball is at least in the hundreds of thousands, probably more than that. And paintball is getting a lot closer to real military. And in fact, I believe the military uses paintball as a training exercise because you're really shooting at people. You're really learning how to act in such a way that you won't get killed, and you can see that that will be fun. So that suggests that people in a lot of contexts enjoy playing soldiers, and that you might be able to leverage that. I go back to my militia model. Part of the problem for a stateless society is we don't have any draft, we don't have any taxes, so we can't pay very many people. You can pay some people, because you can raise money by charity. We do a lot of things that way in our society, but you're not going to get a military on the scale of our military that way. On the other hand, if you're using amateur soldiers who aren't very good, and they cost half as much as professionals, it probably doesn't save you anything, because you need at least twice as many. But if they don't cost anything, it saves you a whole lot of money. And so the idea is that you could have a militia system in a stateless society in which the militia consists of a whole lot of people who are providing their own weapons and doing their military training for some mix of the kind of reasons people do paintball and SCA, and a feeling of sort of patriotic, we're here to defend our society, which moves people. Reasons of that sort. You then, the equivalent of the professional army in the Second Amendment system is a small cadre of professionals being paid largely by charitable money, possibly being paid also by being paid by the amateurs to do things like referee their war games. All right, if you imagine that kind of context. The professionals are the ones who make sure that the communication systems of the amateurs can talk to each other. They're the ones who make sure that everybody is using the same caliber for their weapons. And that then gives you a good deal, not all, but a good deal of a national scale military at a very low cost. I mentioned open source software because that's another example where you have, in that case, a very difficult and sophisticated project. I don't know how much of you know much about open source software, but Linux, which is the third major desktop operating system, is open source. The Apache web server, which a majority of all web pages run on, is open source. And open source is software which is done by people in some sense for the fun of it. That the way an open source project works, for those of you who aren't Silicon Valley geeks, is that somebody has an idea for a program, and he writes a first draft. And he puts it up for anybody else to play with. And everybody else who wants to contributes ideas, modifications, and they send them back to the original person, and he decides which ones are included in the version that everybody else then improves. And why are people willing to work on it? One reason is that since you're part of the development team, you can make sure that the software has the features you want. So if it's software doing something important to you, that's useful. A second reason is that if you're part of the development team and you're specializing on handling floating point numbers, and the problem you have is that your printer is a slightly out-of-date printer and nobody's done a printer driver that works with it. Whoever in the open source project specializes in printer drivers will probably do you a favor. Because after all, you're doing him a favor by working on your part of the project. So it's the kind of social project in which being a part of it, as it were, gives you a kind of status and a kind of credit with the other people doing it. It also gives you status in other senses. There's someone I know online who used to have a job doing computer stuff. Currently he works for the post office. He's a very odd and idiosyncratic guy. And various people who argue with him keep telling him how he ought to go back into the computer business. And he keeps talking about how hard it is to get a job now for various reasons. And one suggestion made to him was, look, why don't you volunteer for an open source project? You don't require anybody to hire you to do that. And if after a while people know that you're one of the really good programmers working on Linux, now you have a reputation that'll get you jobs that pay money. Further reason is that a lot of open source software nowadays is used by ordinary commercial firms. And if you're a firm, one of the advantages of open source software, unlike proprietary software, is that you can find lots of people who know how it works, the people who've worked on it. And if you hire one of the people who knows how it works, his friends will do favors for him. So if you need a particular tweak to that software, or if there's a bug that hasn't bothered anybody else but bothers you in your use, he can talk to the people who can fix it. So it, in fact, at this point is one way, one source for employment, in effect, in that particular world, is being part of one of the open source projects. So that sort of is a very different kind of real-world example where people are doing things they're not being paid to do, and yet are coordinating on quite a difficult and sophisticated kind of project. So if you put all of those together, that suggests a future stateless society in which you have a very large militia, some millions of people, who have armed themselves, who have trained themselves, whose hobby, as it were, is some mixture of target practice, mass maneuvers against somebody else's club with a referee to say who would have won if it was a real battle, and everything in between. Now, that probably doesn't provide you much of the high end. Probably very few hobbyists can afford a tank. There are probably a few who can. I mean, there are private people who own tanks, as it happens. But on the other hand, there are also a lot of businesses. And if you imagine the world I'm describing, one of the ways in which you get good PR is by demonstrating what a patriotic member of the community you are. And so every April 15th, when we have the Liberty Day Parade, there goes the company provided by Apple Computer Company, and they've got Apple's banner flying above them, and they've got some high-tech robot tanks running along with them, and this is how they're demonstrating that you ought to buy an Apple computer because Apple is good guys. And Microsoft has a larger battalion, and they've got a bunch of drones flying over it, and they're as it were competing in that. So I think if you put together, it's sort of a kludge. It's not like, I mean, a lot of solving the public good problem is a kludge. My favorite example of the solution is the one that produces radio and television. All right, this is a public good. If you, aside from cable, pre-cable, if you broadcast a program, anybody can listen to it. How do you pay for it? Some unknown genius thought up the idea of producing not one public good but two. One of them with a positive cost of production and one of them with a negative cost of production. The positive cost of production is the program. The negative cost of production is the advertisement, because someone will pay you to put it on. You tie the two tightly together and you give away the bundle. All right? That's a kludge, but it's a kludge that works. So what I'm imagining is a kludge along this line. Now, there are certainly no guarantees. One nice thing about it is that it solves the same problem as the Second Amendment solves. All right, the problem that occurs to some people is if you have an anarchist society and you somehow give it an army, how do you keep the army from reestablishing government? Well, if the professionals in the army are outnumbered 100 to 1 by the amateurs, and the amateurs aren't a single organization. The amateurs are, you know, a club over here and a club over there and a bunch of Apple employees and a bunch of Microsoft employees who never talk to each other anyway. Not to mention the Google employees. We don't get along very well with either of those groups. It's going to be real hard to put together a military coup with that kind of a dispersed organization. So I think it's a nice solution to that problem. Whether it's an adequate solution to protecting against enemies depends a good deal on how big the enemies are. When I originally wrote The Machinery of Freedom, what I was worrying about was the Soviet Union with an arsenal of nuclear weapons. And I was at that time pretty, I didn't have this scheme, but I had some other imperfect ways of trying to do it, and it wasn't clear to me that you could do it under those circumstances. So that my final comment was, if you can't, it's too early to abolish the last part of government. That I don't like paying taxes, but Washington charges lower rates than Moscow. Fortunately, the Moscow problem has solved itself. And the U.S., in fact, has no enemies that matter at the moment, despite the pretense of the war on terrorism. I did some calculations at the first Iraq War. I added up the GNP of the two sides of that war, and the odds were just about 100 to 1. That's not a war. All right? As far as I know, Mexico is very unlikely to invade the U.S. Canada is very unlikely to invade the U.S. Anybody else, there are serious logistic difficulties. It's very hard to believe that China, which is the closest thing to a potential great power that might dislike us, is going to try to get across the Pacific and invade us, other than selling us stuff, because they're doing it very happily already. So at the moment, under the current environment, it seems to me that the scale of military you get with this in this fashion is more than adequate. It's more than enough to protect us against Mexico and Canada and any other likely serious attackers. I could imagine futures where that wasn't true. In general, I don't believe you can make rigorous proofs of very much. I've actually got each part of Machinery of Freedom has a poem, and the poem for this one, which you can look up on, it's not when you go to sleep, but the poem for this one, which you can find on the new chapters. Let's see if this is still connected. There it is. Here we are. In sharp-edged lands where many dwell, all things are true and or false, and if you try, a little thought will be enough to tell my truth from your illusion or your lie, from which it follows as the night the day, since all of us have use of reason's tools, that all who disagree with what I say, with certainty are either rogues or fools. I have not found it so. The world I see has honest men with minds as good as mine. I can find reasons that seem good to me, but proofs beyond dispute are hard to find. So that's my view in general, and that's my view of this issue. It seems to me that I can describe a plausible way in which, especially if your enemies aren't too strong, a society without a state could successfully defend itself. I am sure there are other ways. When people argue this is obviously impossible, I point out the case of the Comanche Indians, who were a stateless society that blocked Western expansion across Texas for something like 20 years, against an opposition with higher technology and an enormously larger population, because they happened to be a stateless society that were really good at fighting, thought it was fun, saw it as a source of income. You get slaves and horses that way. But the Comanche are not a very attractive society. It's not where I want to live. It was a pretty violent society internally as well. But in general, my claim is that you may be able to do it. Part of what it'll depend on, which is very hard to evaluate, is cultural factors. That if you look historically, in World War I believe that Australia never had a draft. And yet quite a substantial fraction of the male population died in World War I because they volunteered for essentially patriotic reasons. One of the sources for the funding Israeli defense is selling Israeli bonds, and they are selling to people who don't think they're a very good investment, but who care about Israel. Similarly, during World War II, one of the things the English were arming their home defenses for were firearms contributed by private owners. During World War II, the U.S. was selling war bonds, which were not a great investment either, to people who wanted to feel patriotic. So there were a lot of sort of fuzzy ways in which, if people like their society, you are going to be able to get them to do things. There's a very interesting science fiction book that I recommend to you. I'm not sure, the authors are certainly not anarchists, but they're people who think about this stuff. The book is called Oath of Fealty. It's by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle. Niven certainly was 20 years ago probably the best idea man in science fiction. I don't think that's true. Maybe Vinja has that title now, I'm not sure. Pournelle is a very good storyteller, an interesting guy. And Oath of Fealty is a story involving a building the size of a small city that has been built in Los Angeles on the ruins where there was a sort of riot fire that wiped everything out. And the corporation that built it made a deal with the city of Los Angeles and the state of California and the federal government to subcontract everything. So in effect, it's an independent little country inside Los Angeles, and people, the Saints, I think they call it, Todos Santos is the name of it, so the Saints is the term they use for them, don't pay federal tax, but they pay a rent from which the organization pays their equivalent of tax, something which historically happened quite often, as you may know. But the interesting point of the title, is the emotional relationship between the tenants of Todos Santos and Todos Santos. That what happens in the plot is that for some reason the local environmentalists don't like Todos Santos. And there is a fake terrorist raid. A bunch of college students carrying stuff that's designed to look like it's dynamite, who have done a pretty good job of hacking the defense system of Todos Santos, and almost make it to the pipeline bringing in hydrogen, which is the power source. And blowing that up is going to wipe out Todos Santos and kill most of them. And at the point when the fake attack, they don't have real dynamite, but they're trying to make it look as though they do. And at the point when it happens, the chief executive is out of town. His assistant is in charge. And the last-ditch defense, when all the other defenses fails, is poison gas. So he kills the attackers. It turns out one of them is the daughter of a high-up Los Angeles politician. He is arrested for murder. The newspaper man who is covering the story goes to the top executive, who's now back, and he says, if you let me cover the story, I won't tell. What won't you tell? That you're going to break him out of prison. How do you know that we're going to break him out of prison? Because all of your people expect it. Because from their standpoint, he's not somebody who's gotten caught up in a mistake of the legal system. He's the prisoner of war of an enemy government. He was defending them against a totally unprovoked attack, and the fact that he is now in prison on trial for his life is simply injustice, and if we can, we'll get him out. And they do. Hence the title of the field. The point was that because Todos Santos is playing the role normally played by a government, it also becomes the focus of the same sort of emotions of people. And that's an interesting thought. And it's a scary thought in some ways. It could have bad consequences as well as good. But I think it's relevant to what I'm saying because those same sorts of emotions are the reason you'll buy Apple computers after you see on the television that Apple is doing its bit to help try to defend it. So I think that's really what I wanted to say. I was persuaded a long time ago that the advantage of a question period is when you're answering a question, you can be pretty sure someone in the audience is interested in what you're saying. So let me go back. Those are the new chapters. Here is the web page, and here is the URL of the web page. You can find a lot of what I do. A bunch of my books are webbed, all the ones I can get permission to, essentially. And the web page itself, as you can see, I've got machinery at the top. Salamander you have to pay for, but not very much because it's the Kindle file, I think it's $3. I have a blog that you might find interesting. The blog is called Ideas, and as that suggests, it covers everything that occurs to me. All right. So let me take questions. Yes.
In a anarchist society, when you're talking about the funding of national defense, do you think that the rights enforcement agencies you talked about this morning could also provide the resources to defend?
The problem is that they can do it the same reason Apple does. But aside from that, they face the same problem. If my system works well, there are going to be a lot of them. I'm scared of one where there are only a few. And if there are a lot of them, from the standpoint of each one, let the others pay for it. Now, there are various other imperfect methods. I discussed it in the original version of the chapter of machinery. There may be some cases where you can say, well, we aren't going to defend Hawaii unless the Hawaiian landowners manage to get enough money. You can imagine various imperfect ways of getting some funding. Almost no public good is a pure public good, if you think about it. Imagine a radio broadcast. You can say, well, look, if you're in a fringe area, we could arrange our antennas to give you a better or worse service. So there are ways of that sort, but I don't think there's a clean way. one of the solutions that some of the very early writers in the libertarian anarchist movement suggested was insurance companies. And the problem is that if some insurance companies provide national defense, insurance companies that don't can undercut their rates. And that's the same problem. Yes?
So I was at Pepperdine with you, so this has been a long-standing question. So I'm curious, I'm from the Freedom Center at the U of A. I'm curious, sort of from a sociological perspective, do you genuinely, so I understand the sort of ethos of what you just said, economically, but do you genuinely believe that in an anarchic society there will be a sort of public appreciation of the things you're talking about, such that these types of things will be respected? And so this is a more sociological question.
The best way of answering, which I'm not going to do it this time, so I'll point you at it instead.
I probably read it because I'm neurotic.
All right. Well, if you've read the chapter on the economics of virtue and vice.
I have.
All right. Because part of the point of that, I'm trying to analyze two different patterns of behavior.
Okay.
One of them is, why are there people who won't steal even if nobody's watching?
Right.
And the other is, why are there bullies?
Right.
And I'm trying to argue that you don't have to make moral assumptions to explain either of those. That's one way of explaining.
Right.
But that both of those make sense as behavioral strategies in different circumstances.
Can I ask you another question?
Just let me finish this for a moment.
That's fine.
And in particular, that being nice, being honest, caring about other people's welfare, pays off in a society where most transactions are voluntary.
Right.
Because people would rather associate with people like that.
Right.
Being a bully pays off, as long as there aren't too many bullies, in a society where many transactions are involuntary. Because if you're just stuck next to your neighbor and you know that if you do things he doesn't like, he's going to beat you up, you don't do things he doesn't like. And that therefore societies where many transactions are voluntary will have nicer people. So in that sense, that's why it's relevant to your question. Because if we have a society where virtually everything is voluntary, I think you will have people who have themselves programmed themselves to be nicer people than what we're used to. Not perfectly nice people.
Right.
So that's at least a partial answer. But beyond that, I don't feel as though I know enough or anybody really knows enough to give a convincing answer. Now you had a second part to the question.
So the second part of the question is it's been almost a decade, but essentially what we're working on at the Freedom Center is a reconciliation between sort of objectivist, Randian, Rothbardian sort of moral ideas, and also non-objective sort of legal systems, such that, let's say that you literally commit terror on somebody, and you save 10 million lives.
Right.
The legal system is going to spit you out that you're committing an illegal activity.
Right.
But as an epistemic agent, the judge is going to say that what you did is morally reprehensible and bad. But he's going to say, he's going to negate your sentence. And so I'm wondering what you think of, because I'm from the entire time I've been there, I'm very skeptical of that. And I don't know why.
Now, I'm not sure I understand the question.
So it's basically sort of a propriety of sort of an objective moral system that's running concurrently with a legal system, such that you're going to be convicted of X, Y, and Z crimes, but your sentence is going to be mitigated. And
But
that's
doesn't
the end
the
of it.
objective moral system also say that you are less guilty if you did a bad act for some very good reason?
Right. So what I'm asking you is this is what I've been skeptical of the entire time.
Both the moral system and the legal system could work
Do you
that way.
need that propriety? Do you need that sort of interrelationship, or can you have a sort of objective moral system that does not need to be reciprocated by a legal system that's going to mitigate sentences?
Well, there certainly are moral systems that aren't supported by legal
Right.
systems. There are quite a lot of them historically. Ours, for instance. So I guess
Do you understand my question?
I don't think I understand the question.
Okay. So the question is let's say that you, Friedman.
Why don't we discuss this afterwards, because it's going
Okay.
to take too long economically. Yes, back there in the middle.
Yeah, with guerrilla warfare being what it is today and modern tactics and fourth generation weaponry and whatnot, I have no trouble believing that a fairly well-armed free society can defend itself. But what's to prevent some enterprising young people from seeing war as a high-risk business venture and going Julius Caesar or Cortez, or to use your Comanche example, just basically preying on less fortunate nation states?
less fortunate than that, nation states? You're saying there might be people within the anarcho-capitalist society who organized a business of predation outside that society.
Yes.
Could happen. As I commented last time, my view of the Norse armies that ravaged England in the 8th century is they were entrepreneurial projects. Situations in which you could get land and loot by going and fighting the Saxons, who weren't as good as fighting as you were most of, until Alfred came along and improved their abilities a little. So, could happen. And, you know, if enough other people in the society disapprove of it, you might get flack and it might stop you from doing it, but I don't think there are any guarantees. But of course, then hopefully some of those other societies also develop anarcho-capitalist institutions, then they can sue you when you do that. Yeah.
So in a anarchic society, if you have kind of like corporate sponsored militias, like Apple sponsored a militia, what is to keep Apple from actually just trying to obliterate like Google like force?
Because Apple is a tiny player on a national scale.
And
Look, the U.S. Well, governments combined in the U.S. spend something like 35 to 40% of national income. If you think about a very big corporation, its total assets. I don't know, let's see. What's the current budget? $2 or $3 trillion a year. So the current budget is about $10 billion a day. All right. Apple's a very rich company, so it's in the tens of billions. So it might take as much as a week for the federal government to spend as much as the total value of Apple. So it's just in terms of scale, in this society, if you had a society where there were a very small number of companies that were very big, you'd want to worry about that.
And also, what would keep like Bill Gates from hiring hitmen for like to take out Tim Cook or something?
That's not a national defense issue, though. But the answer is what I was talking about this morning, that other people would have firms that were in the business of protecting their rights.
Okay.
But might not always succeed. I mean, you know, people do get killed in our society too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sir, can you explain maybe the possible implementations of securitizing open source work with cryptocurrencies and their application through decentralized autonomous
No, I haven't thought enough about that. I think the idea of anonymous e-cash is a very attractive idea. Unfortunately, Bitcoin is not anonymous, although there apparently are protocols people suggested that might work to anonymize it. Even a non-anonymous e-cash is very useful. I mean, I'm in favor of Bitcoin, but I'd like better something like a Xiaomi and digital cash, and you're familiar with that.
Right.
And that has some very interesting possibilities, both positive and negative, but on net positive. I wrote an article on strong privacy back, I don't know, 15,
Right,
20
but the
years
idea
ago.
of using these as holding a certain amount of the supply in trust and then applying it to a particular use case for a public good. So you could use it for like Hardcoin or Mathcoin if you were to fund a mathematical research, or you could do it for airplane.
But I'm still not sure how you solve the public good problem. That's how do you avoid the fact that if you pay for it and it benefits me, I get the benefit without paying.
Well, its adoption as a currency can increase its value. So,
Yes.
With this so-called spontaneous order that you were talking about in terms of raising some kind of militia to be a national defense provider, and you talk about how people go to like the paintball courts or to these reenactments, et cetera, et cetera. With a large enough voluntary militia, do you think that there could be a problem where two guys on this, one neighborhood are like, so, I hear the Canadians are invading tomorrow, are you going to go fight them? I'm like, nah, someone else will take care of that, those are two guys, And then, like, enough of that happens, you don't really have much of a national defense anymore.
But presumably it's not going to be two guys. It's
Two
going
guys
to
in
be
a
your
tank.
club, which is, 20 or 50 or 100 or 500, depending where you are, guys, judging by such things as I've observed about those. And there's going to be a command structure with professionals. Now, you can ignore them if you like, but, everybody, you'll be very embarrassed when the Joanne will go out with you because you're a wimp.
I'll edit you out.
I should say Kipling makes that point
Leave me in.
pretty explicit.
No, just take off your beard.
I think, well, I'm gonna leave it, because I don't know enough for certain. Yes.
This is bouncing off of an earlier question in reference to Apple and large corporations. And I would just like to know that if in an ANCAP society, with such large-scale corporations we have today, would they even have means to exist, or would they just
They
become
might.
fiction?
They might. There are economies of scale and there are diseconomies of scale. And some libertarians like to argue that in a freed economy, large corporations would disappear, but I think it's unlikely. It seems to me that there are some reasons for them. That, as you may or may not know, in the 19th century, you had something rather like what some modern libertarians refer to as an agoric economy. That is a system of everybody subcontracting, what was called the inside contracting system. And it largely disappeared because it was being out-competed once people worked out satisfactory ways of running hierarchical organizations that were a little bit bigger. So hierarchy has disadvantages, it has advantages, there are trade-offs both ways. And I don't know whether the existence of the government results in bigger or smaller firms. Because on the one hand, big firms can use political influence to get things. On the other hand, there's a sense in which having regulatory state means that somebody is watching you and worrying about what you're doing, and that's more of a problem. You've got a big hierarchical organization with information going up and down, and somebody might complain about what you're doing and so forth. So I don't really know, as an economic question, whether government makes firms bigger or smaller. Yes.
Where would corporations get their their status as
Well, this is again really a question. This is really a question of my talk this morning, which was about the legal system, not about the national defense. But in terms of the legal system, the system I described then is one in which individuals are customers of rights enforcement agencies. Rights enforcement agencies interact with private courts. Private courts are offering as part of the package they're selling the legal system. And according to what ended up as the equilibrium of that market, you might or might not find that the rules they agreed to include limited liability. You, after all, have limited liability too, right? If you commit a tort, they can't confiscate your heart, although it might have a high market value, or your retina or your cornea. So the fundamental problem of limited liability is not in contractual arrangements, because when you contract with a corporation, you know there's an upper limit to what they can pay you. The fundamental problem is in non-contractual, in tort relationships, where the corporation might do something imposing a cost on third parties who have no contractual relationship with it at all, but so might you. And in each case, there is some limit to the amount that one can be held liable.
Unfortunately, we're out of time.
All right.